During the operator forum last week, we had several questions that came up regarding how to take care of, or how to protect, I guess, your business going forward, given what we know now and have experienced now with the coronavirus. So I appreciate you all tuning in today, because we have two great speakers who are going to share with you some answers to those questions. With us this afternoon to introduce those speakers is Greg Takahara, who helped to plan today's webinar. Greg is the CEO of Tourism Cares, which is our partner, and it's the leading philanthropic organization for preserving travel and tourism for future generations. Greg is no stranger to today's topics. He's a lawyer himself. He previously served as the president of TripMate, travel insurance administrator and service provider. Before that, he was a senior manager at Aon Affinity and Berkely Travel. And prior to that, he was general counsel for the Mark Travel Corporation. So he's got quite a background here to help get us started and kick us off today. Greg, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I just wanted to say hello to the entire IITA community. I can't believe it's not even have been 3 months since I saw many of you in St. Petersburg. It seems like the whole world has changed completely since we were all there together. And I was speaking with regard to sustainability. And when Lisa approached me with regards to setting up this webinar with regards to insurance and legal issues and how we're all going to cope in the post-COVID world, I was immediately able to reach out to two resources, both people that I've known for over 20 years, and in Alastair's case, somebody that I actually worked with for over 15 years at Aon. I have said, you know, yet in my seminar regarding sustainability, there are a lot of parallels between sustainability and risk management. It's all about, you know, protecting our best interests. And so today we have two really great speakers, again, people I've known as renowned experts in this area. Jeff Ment, who is with Ment Law Offices. Jeff and I have collaborated for many, many years, working together on the professional liability program that I worked with Alastair at Aon. So he has successfully defended companies like yours in litigation. Jeff has a strong background in travel, including very personal, in that his mother was a travel advisor, and he similarly worked in a past life at Eastern Airlines. And then, as I've referenced, Alastair MacMillan-Bell, who's Senior Vice President at Aon Affinity Travel Practice. Alastair has worked both on the underwriting and claims side of the professional liability program that many of you are participants on. So I know they're going to have a lot of sage advice for you. And Lisa, thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this introduction.
Thanks, Greg. Jeff, you want to take it away?
Yeah, let me get my screen set up here. All right, how are we doing with that?
Looks good. We can see it. You might want to start the slideshow, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Beginning.
Yeah.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Ment, and I am talking to you from my Westport, Connecticut office, which is around the corner from my Westport, Connecticut house. So I walk to work, and it makes me feel like I'm having a somewhat regular day in a somewhat irregular world. So Greg, thank you for the super kind introduction. Lisa, it's so nice to see you and be with IITA today, and to go through what I think to be an important part of planning for the future, because there clearly will be a future in travel. My brief background is that I've been a travel lawyer for about 28 years, And so I've seen a lot of crises, and I understand that we always are a resilient bunch and we do come back. Greg mentioned my outside experience in the industry. I did work for my mom, which was a tough job. Started filing brochures, ended up answering the phone, learned how to work on Sabre, began booking people's reservations, did that for a long time, had a job as a tour guide for a company for a summer, and spent 8 years with Eastern Airlines and 1 year with Continental Airlines. And so my comments today are really a mix of real life experience, some law experience, and just some hopefully good common sense. We've seen a lot of crises in travel. We do feel like the odds are against us right now, but I'm going to give you some ideas of what we're going to need to do to bounce back and to help protect you in this recovery phase. So, planning for the future is a good idea to start now, because what we need to do is we need to think about the way that we contract with our customers. I use the word contract in a very general sense, but in the travel space, usually a tour operator is contracting on two different sides, one side with the customer and one side with the supplier. Some of my comments today are specific to one side versus the other, and some are sort of generic and apply to both sides. So I think as we talk about planning for the future, and for the suppliers that are listening, my comments are equally applicable to you too. We need to do things a little bit differently. We need to work on some key clauses, which I'm sure everybody can guess what they are, but they're related to payment, cancellation, and force majeure. The second point here is just sort of a personal pet peeve currently of mine, and maybe of some of yours. I find it very hard to enjoy the credit card problems that we're having right now with chargebacks. And I'm going to talk more about that in the second part of my talk, because part of the future planning is going to relate to how we accept payment in the future, because right now it's not working very well with credit card processors. And force majeure clauses have gotten a lot of attention over the past, I'd say, 2 months. And there's a lot of misinformation about them. So I'm hopefully going to give you some real good life examples of clauses that you can use. I'll make this presentation available to IITA, so you don't have to copy everything down or take quick photos. And if you have questions about it, of course, you can always ask. Force majeure in general is a legal concept that allows one side of a contract to get out of having to perform the contract. So that's a practical description. A better description are the words that are written here. Force majeure, parties may, one, be in a contractual relationship with a counterparty that asserts it cannot perform, or two, finding themselves unable to fulfill their own contractual obligations. So force majeure clauses, doctrines of impossibility and frustration, and material adverse change clauses are of the utmost importance. Now, Greg and I, having suffered through law school contracts classes decades ago, will remember that these are the hallmarks of when a side can get out of performing the obligations of a contract. There's another theory in the law, which is called specific performance. Sometimes in a contract, when the other side isn't doing what they're supposed to do, you can be sued for specific performance. In other words, someone is making you live up to your contractual obligations. Force majeure is the defense to that. Force majeure, right now, those two words are being thrown around by anybody who thinks they can be helped by those two words. That might even be customers. It might be tour companies. It might be suppliers. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, and it's really not that simple. Cute little pictures are always good on webinars. Force majeure, unforeseeable circumstances or events that prevent a party from fulfilling a contract. So the bottom 5 little cartoon illustrations show what we always sort of thought would be force majeure issues. We're learning now, obviously, that there are other things that can come through and be far from some of these. So when I give these talks to groups, I try to make the law seem more understandable and more in our world. So I talk to you as a travel guy who happened to go to law school, so I can try to mix these things together for you. Force majeure clause is governed by contract and state law. So you need to know what's in your state law when you're talking about enforcing these kinds of provisions. Performance is excused only when the event that's expressly included within the force majeure clause. Sometimes you see a long list of things that could happen for the force majeure clause to be triggered. And sometimes you see a very short description about things that are unforeseeable or acts of God. And so I guess my best answer now, having seen what's happened and reading a lot of court decisions, is that our force majeure clauses need to be more specific, more detailed, and cover more of the horrible things that can happen, because otherwise a court might not be willing to enforce it. So absent the express inclusion of a specific event, relief is typically not needed unless the disabling event was unforeseeable at the time of the contract. And that's what we're arguing right now. For those of you that don't have great force majeure clauses, this is what I'm trying to use on your behalf, is to say it wasn't in there because we couldn't even have contemplated a worldwide pandemic that would shut down the travel industry. So down the bottom, there must be a causal connection between the alleged force majeure event and a party's inability to perform. The party invoking the clause must show what action it took to perform regardless of the event. So that's like what we would call black letter law, just the stuff that you find in court decisions. And I'm trying to bring that to life so we can figure out how to really use it. When we are in the tour business, the tour operation business is made up of many components. I don't have to tell you that, but lots of little components go into making a bigger product, and every component is vital. Every component is important. Every component usually has its own contract. Although sometimes, candid in our industry, we sometimes are a little lazy and we don't spend the time to actually get a contract with a vendor for something. And that has proven to be right now a problem. So every contract should provide for termination in the event that something happens over which neither party had any control. So this is something that includes an event beyond your control that makes it operationally impossible to hold the event because more than half of the expected attendees are unable or unwilling to travel to the event or to the hotel. And if you're the tour operator, you want to have inserted in your force majeure clause something along the lines of getting a refund of monies paid. Now, there's a couple words that I just read over quickly that are really important. So the first is the word operationally possible, because what is impossible is left the mind and imagination of the person using the word. My impossible isn't your impossible necessarily. So when we talk about something that's operationally impossible, it gives us a better opportunity to explain why we can't fulfill the obligation of the contract. So here's a real life example. So in real life, yesterday, I was negotiating with a hotel in Nashville over the cancellation of a convention for June. And the hotel contract had a impossibility provision in the contract. So my client was invoking the impossibility provision. It did not have the word operational. It just said impossible. But what it said was that it was only triggered if it was impossible for the hotel to provide its service. So think about that. Is the hotel able to provide the service? It's open, it's not closed, it's selling rooms. So the hotel's position was that it is very much possible for them. And we were arguing that it's impossible because our group can't get there. So that final chapter hasn't been written yet because we're still going back and forth. And when we talk about the law, looking yesterday at Tennessee law, which is important, not necessarily because it's Tennessee law for my talk, but it's important to know what your law is, where you are, because in Tennessee, they really, according to the Supreme Court of Tennessee from 2019, they're going to hold you to the four corners of your contract, and they're not going to let you insert like extra stuff to try to explain something. So that's like a strict constructionist perspective of a contract. It is not very helpful when you have a contract that's a little ambiguous and a little hard to explain, because from my client's perspective, we signed a contract that talked about impossibility really just on one side. So if I had reviewed that contract first, I might have thought we should level that out to make it a more equal impossibility clause. So we'll see. Anybody who's interested in how that turns out can check with me in a week or so. So from a tour operator perspective, a force majeure clause with no refund language doesn't do much other than relieve the tour operator or the supplier from fulfilling the obligation. If the supplier doesn't have to perform its duties if prevented by causes beyond its control, then typically there's no refund provision listed in your force majeure. And so everyone should take a look at, dust off and look at your terms and conditions. It's always a good experience for you. And in particular, pay attention to your force majeure clause to see what it says. If you are a supplier and you're looking to do business with tour operators and you're looking to do business in the new world, maybe you consider offering this as one of the terms that you would put forth to the tour operator in an effort to entice the tour operator to work with you. Likewise, from the tour operator's perspective, you want to have this clause for the very reason that we find ourselves right now often being unable to refund customers because we don't have the money. So for those of you that are caught up in this ping pong ball problem, where you're the ping pong ball and the customer is hitting you on one side of your head and your supplier is hitting you on the other side of your head, at the end of the day, all you have are two dents in your head and nobody happy. So this is a way to think about what to do in the future so that we can try to get back on track. We're not going to be derailed forever, but we need to be creative in getting back on track. One way force majeure clauses are just like the one I told you about the hotel in Nashville, which I won't use its name, but it starts with an H. So the one-way force majeure, while the supplier may be excused from performing its duties, the group isn't. This means that the group still owes the money if it must cancel due to terrorist incidents, for example. So that one-way impossibility clause isn't doing much for me or my client. And so now it's time to get creative. So part of my creative argument yesterday was that the hotel really cannot possibly host us because of the governor's safe distancing and social distancing guideline, because it's not a law. So that's one way to try to be creative and to say that the hotel can't possibly ensure and promise that everyone will always be 6 feet or more away from each other. It may not be the best argument, but sometimes you have to be somewhat creative to try to get your way. So this has a lot of words, but it's a new sample clause for a tour operator to look for from a supplier. So I'm going to read it just because it's important to see all the words that we need to now say. So the operator cannot accept liability and shall be entitled to a full refund. So we get it right out there, right at the beginning. Not a credit. Again, we get it right out there. We don't want credits. They're not helping keep clients and customers happy. Where the performance or prompt performance of either party's contractual obligations is presented or affected, or a tour is canceled either by us or our guest, that's important too, as a result of circumstances amounting to force majeure. So that's a really great first sentence. It's a great way to open up your force majeure clause. And then you should list as many things as you can possibly think of for what force majeure means. And that's what the next few paragraphs, next few sentences talk about. And then the bottom, in the case of force majeure, supplier shall promptly refund all money paid for services and cease all work for the specified event affected by force majeure. So this is my idea of a good force majeure clause for tour operators to ask for when negotiating with suppliers, and really all suppliers. It's restaurants, it's motor coach, it's venues, it's hotels, it's all of those kinds of things, it's attractions. And look, I'm not naive. I get it. This isn't going to work for everyone. It's not going to be agreed to by everyone. In many instances, you get a rate sheet for your new year program. You don't even get a contract. So what I'm really asking you to do is to think outside the box. Maybe use DocuSign. Maybe send contracts and rate sheets with this provision and ask that it be initialed or signed off on. It requires us to do things a slight bit different than we have been doing them. And while we are typically reluctant to change, this is something that will help you in the future. Now, for those of you that are on the other side of your contractual obligations, you're talking to customers, this is a force majeure clause that you might consider for your customers. This one's a little different. We cannot accept liability, provide any refund, or pay any compensation where the performance or prompt performance of our contractual obligation is presented or affected because of force majeure. So think about how much different your arguments would be right now with customers if you had simply this: we cannot accept any liability or provide any refunds when we all are stuck with a force majeure event. I had a phone call with a lawyer yesterday. I'm not even sure where he was from. I think the Illinois, Indiana area. And he was complaining about a school trip not being able to happen to New York City for the obvious reasons. And he said, well, it's a force majeure event, and so we should get our money back. And I said, well, I'm looking at the contract. There's actually no force majeure clause even in the contract. So I don't know how you're coming up with this argument. If it's not in the contract, it's going to be hard for you to argue force majeure in a broad context of just the world in general, because it has to be in the contract for it to be applicable. And so frustratingly, he said, yeah, I know, but we all know it's still a force majeure event. And I think his name was Don. I said, Don, that's not going to really matter. I mean, we're not going to go in front of a judge and talk about a force majeure event when there's no language even in the contract. So again, brings us back to the point, you got to put these things in your contracts so that you can rely upon them later on. Okay, so that's the whole thing on force majeure and some contract terms. Some companies have been pretty good about updating your terms and conditions currently for what we find ourselves in, which is the new world, the sad new world, these new times where we don't really have good answers. And so I want to share with you some thoughts about this. Number one is it's pretty creative. It's pretty creative to change your terms and conditions basically midstream. So some would say that's not really fair. Others would say that you're entitled to change your terms and conditions because after all, your terms and conditions say that they can be updated from time to time and that the people are obligated to follow the terms and conditions applicable at their time of travel, which is a whole lot different than their time of booking. So again, it's another change that we can be thinking of in our terms and conditions. So we're now starting to see on a regular basis new landing pages on websites called Travel Update, COVID-19 Update, Flexible Travel. These are updated terms and conditions. They are trying to deliver an upbeat message when offering a credit or rescheduling, hashtag postpone, not cancel, in place of a refund, because the industry is besieged with refund requests and we are drowning in them, and we're not drowning in new bookings right now. So it's a very difficult balancing act. And so some companies are putting new terms out about refunds and credits. So the reality is it's going to be challenged by somebody someplace, and we don't know the legal success of changing your terms and conditions once you've already left the station, figuratively speaking. But it's an important way because many of you are being successful in getting customers to understand that the landscape of travel has changed. Just look anywhere. Today, TripAdvisor laid off 25% of its staff. Unfortunately, we're still reeling, and equally unfortunately, for those of you that have applied for PPP loans, if you've gotten them, that is fantastic, but the majority of us in the travel industry haven't been able to be successful with that, and that's leaving tour operators and suppliers desperately wondering about surviving in the next day. So if you're having a new term and condition page, it needs an upbeat message from the boss saying that why we're doing this, and it needs to be enticing so that people think that we're giving them options. People like options. They don't like to be told what to do, and I think that's a good way to deliver the message. Looking forward, if you don't already have the capacity to change your terms and conditions, you need to. You need to change your terms and conditions by saying that you can change your terms and conditions and that the applicable terms and conditions at the time of travel govern. So this is my super negative section, and for anyone who is a credit card processor or owns a credit card company, I'm super sorry that I'm really negative and one-sided, but I only really can see one side here, and that is that we are being killed by chargebacks. We're being killed by the credit card industry that we've partnered with for so long, and it's not working very well. So let me just share with you that in the chargeback algorithm, there's two companies plus you and the customer. So there's you and the customer, there's the customer's credit card issuer, and there's your credit card processor. And so when these chargebacks are happening, you have like no control. It's crazy. But the credit card issuer, the customer's credit card issuer, is making the decisions most of the time. Most of the time, they're finding in favor of their client, the customer, and not you. These statistics here on chargebacks are disheartening, because what it really shows us is people don't care. They have no idea about the implication of a chargeback, and they have no hesitancy to make a chargeback. And if these statistics are right, and I think they are, if you've done one successfully, you're more likely to do them again. When we thought of the word chargeback before this big crisis, we thought of somebody saying, my credit card got charged in error and it was fraud. I've never heard of the ABC Tour Company. Well, those are easy. What we're finding now are chargebacks that say, I wanted to go on my trip on November 15th, and now they're telling me I have to go on December 15th, so I want my money back. And credit card companies are agreeing with them in record numbers. And I had a recent one for a tour operator. We sent in a very detailed response of our terms and conditions. The terms and conditions actually included that we had the right to reschedule the trip. And the response we got from Visa was, your terms and conditions do not matter. The customer is not getting their service on the date they were promised. And so we lost. We need to do a better job lobbying. We need to do a better job as an industry having partners that will work with us and not turn against us. When you get a chargeback, you need to try to work with the customer, because as we have seen now far too many times, if you don't make a deal with the customer, you might get a worse deal with the credit card company. So try to work with the customer and let them know what it means to you to have the chargeback. So again, I think real life stories are helpful. So last week I talked to a travel advisor, a hosted travel advisor. So one of her clients did a chargeback for a $19,000 trip to Japan and was successful. And the host agency wrote a letter to the travel advisor and said, you owe us $19,000 because your client was successful in a chargeback. So just sort of imagine that, right? You're imagining the David and Goliath in that relationship. And I said to the travel advisor, there's nothing in your contract that requires you to pay back a chargeback. This doesn't make any sense. So at the end of the day, the plan was that she was going to call the customer and explain that the chargeback may result in her taking $19,000 out of her pocket to give back to the customer. So customers don't know what chargebacks mean. I read one report that said that they thought it was coming from the credit card company, like there's a big pot of money somewhere and you're just going to get a refund. So we know that's not the case. So keep talking to them. Dispute the chargeback, give all the information you can, give all the terms and conditions, tell them the IP address that the customer used to consent to the transaction, and do your very best to get this information in on time. They give you a deadline. The minute the deadline passes, they decide you've lost. And if they get your response the next morning, it doesn't matter, you've lost. My ideas about chargebacks and credit cards is very negative. I'm not sure why we should work with credit card companies currently. I know it's a business thing and we like to take credit cards, but people can transfer money electronically easier than ever. And so maybe there's a new way of doing this. If, however, you are going to have to continue to take credit cards, like probably 100% of you, get a chargeback waiver added to your terms and conditions. get the customer to agree in your terms and conditions that chargebacks aren't allowed, parentheses, unless actual fraud, and say that you're going to hold the customer responsible for any losses and damage you have as a result of their chargeback. And of course, good business practice, always get a signed authorization. Okay, so this may less applicable to IITA members, but I think it's important for tour operators in general. So for tour operators, this might be applicable to you for travel going the other way that you might have. So travel outside of the country, outside of the US, international travel. Many countries are legislating that there won't be refunds. There'll only be credits. And so this list is growing. I just added Colombia to it because I had a client the other day get a letter from a Colombian supplier saying, hey, the government has saved us and we don't have to give you refunds. So if you know any US senators and Congress people, this would be a great idea. Why don't we get our point across that we can't give back money if we don't have the money from the suppliers? It seems like such a simple story to tell, but it falls on deaf ears when you're talking to the customer because they don't really care. But our problem in the industry is that countries are now dictating that we can't get refunds, and it makes it virtually impossible for us to have a good ending to the story with our customers. So I don't think we need to belabor this point, but there are these countries out there, and it's not working very well for us. Here's the new one from most recently, Colombia Decree 557 authorizes tourist service providers and airlines that receive requests for cancellation, withdrawal, and other circumstances relating to refunds to make refunds to users through reprogrammed services. We should use those words. I'm sorry, folks, we are reprogramming your service. But that's what the law says. My feeling personally is once a few European Union nation countries start doing this, they all will. The UK, separate now from the EU, has already started a movement to save UK companies from having to give back refunds. So here's some thoughts for life after this, life after COVID-19, things that we should be thinking about. Everybody knows this. We all keep telling this to ourselves because it is true, not because we just like to hear it, but people are going to want to travel again. You can pick up any newspaper, pick up any journal. It's talking about people wanting to go again, but the issue is going to be on the expectations of us, the providers. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to say things that are pleasing to the consumer so that they trust us. So consumers post-COVID are going to have expectations, and this is really what we need to be thinking about as tour operators and suppliers or DMOs. We need to do things that promote and provide a healthy, sanitary environment. And maybe you do this already. Maybe this is super simplistic, but hand sanitizer, masks, accommodations that promote sanitary, clean practices, trying to allow for social distancing. Look, every unfilled seat is money lost. I 100% understand and remember from Eastern Airlines how we learned about revenue management. And once that seat has left the gate and it's not filled, you can never get that money back. I get that. But I also understand that those empty seats now are going to be one reason that people decide who they're going to travel with. So it's something that we have to do. I see hotels are coming up with all sorts of nifty ideas, taking out the mini bar, the coffee maker, and the buffet, and you don't have to meet anybody or talk to anybody. But it's a way of doing business, and it can be adapted in many different contexts. So we just need to be creative. Smaller groups to secondary lower traffic destinations. Another idea that you guys are probably well ahead of me, but there are very interesting opportunities that are out there for smaller groups. not only are there smaller vehicles, but there are secondary places that you couldn't get to easily with a large motor coach that you may now be able to get to and create new itineraries. This is, in my opinion, I believe that it's a product manager's dream to be able to now work with and come up with new ideas, something different than what we've always expected. So marketing is a mix of creativity, gimmicks, ideas, and solutions. So I have some clients that have offered like layaway deals in the past. And maybe it's something that we kind of do already when we talk about deposit dates and final payment dates. But people are interested in the science of advertising. And when you talk about, by the way, I'm sharing with you what I learned as a business major at the University of Connecticut in 1985 to 1989. So some of this might be kind of outdated, but I think it's still relevant. But I think that people are interested in how they're being sold and what they're being sold. So if a client makes an initial deposit and then selects their own payment terms up until the final payment date, people get control. People want control. People feel that they are entitled to control because now they feel that they've got the upper hand and leverage. A corollary to this is trying to work with your suppliers to be more flexible about refunds. Now, this is an interesting idea. It's conceptually not the easiest to explain, but I'll share with you my idea. So this is not insurance. This is not a travel insurance kind of product, but some companies offer like change policies where it's not an insurance product, but you allow the customer to basically be able to cancel or change up into a window of time, call it 72 hours. And then you give them a credit for the future. In order to be able to do that, though, you have to have in place an agreement with your supplier that gives you the flexibility of essentially a 72-hour window for cancellations. So why would a supplier do that? Well, a supplier might want to do that because you're really trying to be creative and get new business in a world filled now with phones not ringing about new business. So if you advertise to the customer that they could, up until 72 hours, change or cancel their reservation while getting a full travel credit with your company, it could either be transferable or not transferable. That's up to you. It would say not redeemable for cash, and it would have like a 2-year window. So you've got the money in your bank, you're giving a credit, but you're allowing the customer to cancel that trip up to a very short window. Now, it needs some fine print, right? It needs some fine print to say this doesn't maybe apply to airline cancellation fees, because maybe you're doing land only, maybe they're using frequent traveler awards for tickets, maybe they're going through a consolidator for their tickets, but it's one way to sort of get it out there that it's an idea for selling. Another idea, which I've seen in the New York Times, so this was not my personal idea, but I read it in Sunday's New York Times travel section, which has gotten smaller and smaller by the week, unfortunately. It's like gift cards. So you have a $100 gift card with your tour company, but you get a $300 value when you redeem it. So you, the tour company, are getting money in your door now for later. Later, you're going to have to give them something a little more enticing, but it's another way to sell. Okay. Do we have liability when people get sick with COVID on your trip? Well, listen, people get sick on your trips all the time. You've had people get sick for decades on your trips. You've had people die on your trips. You've had people come down with the flu on your trips. What are we to do? Are things different now? So, duty to warn. All sellers of travel have a duty of care to protect travelers from unreasonable risk of harm. For a plaintiff to win, so plaintiff is the person who brings a lawsuit. For the plaintiff to win, it must be proven that there was a duty of care that the duty of care was breached, the breach caused a loss, and that there were damages. So it's incumbent upon travel companies to assess your risk, and keep in mind the risk is the destination, the transportation company, the hotel, and warn and protect travelers from foreseeable risks. So you need to update your waiver and assumption of risk documents to include things that make reference to COVID-19 specifically. You can require high-risk individuals to purchase travel protection with medical coverage. You can develop strong terms related to travel protection insurance, educate employees of new procedures for COVID safety, develop a plan for guests who become sick while traveling. That's going to require that you work with your partners and suppliers about what's going to happen if somebody has to stay behind. All of this stuff can actually happen. Send customer pre-trip health questionnaire. And you can require that they tell you if they've been exposed to COVID or had symptoms in the last 5 days. If you're doing that, you should also reserve in your terms and conditions the right to dismiss any passenger for any reason at the tour operator's discretion. Our suppliers need to be prepared to work with our tour operators to follow the best practices, accommodations and social distancing and employee sick leave. So you give your employees a break and allow them to stay home when they are sick. So my last point, which will be very quick because I'm running out of time, is just about insurance. And of course, Alastair knows a whole lot more, and Greg does as well, about insurance. But a lot of you are asking me, well, what about my insurance? Fundamentally, most of you have errors and omission insurance, which is very helpful when you're alleged to have done something wrong. But in this instance, you haven't done anything wrong. So you want to look towards other kinds of insurance, which are known as business interruption, contingent business interruption.
It's
based on
the cyst.
value.
It's the same cyst as last time.
Yeah.
Interruption
Yeah.
now for a second time.
Right.
We can just have it heal.
Yeah.
But it will rupture again.
All right.
He said it's just a matter of time of when it will rupture.
Yeah.
Or he can remove
You want
it.
to make sure that you're on mute, please?
Okay, so commercial insurance, business interruption coverage extension for civil authority decisions is a kind of coverage that is would be triggered if the government stopped you from being able to do something. So again, we're talking about very specific kinds of insurance that need to be discussed with a very sophisticated insurance company, agent, broker. Aon, of course, is our go-to partner in insurance issues. You should talk to them about what coverage is available through them, and they know a lot more than I do about that. So let's see here. Seem to be event cancellation insurance is another kind of insurance that may not really work for a lot of you, but it's insurance to cover a specific identifiable event, and it's insurance that allows you to recoup money in the event that the event can't happen. So it probably doesn't work for most of us for what we do, but it's something to at least consider. Okay, so I rushed at the end because it was 2:53, but I think you get the gist of it. We're going to be okay. Okay, so I'm looking to see if we have questions or if Alastair wants to talk.
Again, feel free to either raise your hand or use the chat feature if you have any questions for Jeff. I'm not
I'll
seeing
jump
any.
in. I'll jump in and ask a question, Jeff. When you're talking about the development of, let's call it force majeure law, do you think that there's going to be a lot of disparity between how the states approach the interpretation? You had mentioned, a strict kind of constructional view of four corners, in terms of Tennessee. So that's one aspect of how one state may address contract laws versus another state. We've often talked about different types of clauses within terms and conditions, such as forum selection clauses and arbitration clauses. And we know that certain jurisdictions are more favorable for our community than not. How do you think that the force majeure law development is going to go?
I think that most courts, in doing a small sample survey that I've done over the past few weeks, most courts are going to allow us to benefit from force majeure clauses because of the completely unforeseeable consequences that we find ourselves in today. So I think that a force majeure clause is going to be interpreted broadly. And I think that catch-all, if something was unforeseeable to both parties at the time of contracting, is sort of the savings clause for us in most of those court decisions. That's a good point, though, that you raised about forum selection, and it's one I hadn't added to think about here. But all of you should think about you should think about whether or not you want to put a forum selection clause in your contract. Forum selection means at the end of your terms and conditions, you tell the customer that if they want to fight with you, they have to go to the courthouse in a certain state, typically your state where you are. But if your state is unfavorable, you have the option of putting no state. You're not required to have a forum selection. And why pick a bad one? Pick none. Right. So I've given that advice to people when you have laws that are not favorable. And California, I don't want to pick on California too much, but if I had to pick on a place, I'd probably pick on California. I'd pick on them because of their archaic seller or travel laws that are hard to even read for a lawyer. And I'd say, don't pick California as your forum. So digressed, but good point.
And we did have a question come in from Frank in the chat. And Frank, feel free to unmute yourself and add anything to this. But the question is, so I have a situation with a hotel. Although there is an impossibility clause in the contract, they are trying every which way for us to reschedule and not issue a refund. But my client wants a refund. The actual arrival is May 14th, which will not happen. They're also threatening to charge the cancellation fee.
So that's a real life problem that if we had to take a poll, most of you are suffering from in one form or another. And there's no way, okay, let me back up for a second. So a lot of our trouble is that we want to cancel things that are too far out, like September or June, but May is here. So something is clearly not going to be able to happen in May. And so depending on what state it is, some states talk about the doctrine of impracticability, which is a cousin of the impossibility doctrine. And it's if this state where Frank, where you have this hotel contract, has adopted this impracticability argument, then I think you should use that. But clearly, the hotel, you should also look to see what kind of arbitration clause, if any, do they have in the hotel contract, because I think it's going to be very easy for you to fight this and prevail and not be bullied by the hotel in this instance. Yeah, I'd let them threaten all they want to charge you the cancellation fee. Let them try to win it, collect it, and get it from you. Alastair, should we add anything about insurance? I did it so quickly, I'm not even sure what I said, but do you want to comment on any of that?
No, I think you did. Thank you. I mean, that was a great and very insightful, Jeff. I mean, I would only say that, I mean, there is capacity and availability. I think, unfortunately, today most probably is a little cost prohibitive, given what's going on in the insurance markets. But it is definitely an option, both in the business interruption, contingent business interruption, and on the event cancellation. But as Jeff described, event cancellation really is a single event. And I think most probably for everyone here on the call, you're really looking for an annual type policy. to protect your earnings throughout the year, other than if you have a short window through a summer period where you may be able to aggregate those into a multiple event type insurance. But there's definitely capacity out there. I would also tell everyone on the call that don't get too optimistic. It's not a particularly cheap product to purchase. Between the deductible and the premium, underwriters tend to charge quite a hefty rate for this, and certainly given what we're coming out of in terms of COVID-19, I think the prices are going to be even more material than they were pre-COVID-19. But yeah, there's definitely insurance availability on a case-by-case or an annual basis.
Thank you. Shocking. Another question.
Do you have any other questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand and take yourself off mute, or use the chat feature if you have any additional questions for our guests today.
Jeff, I've got, I don't know if it's an actual question or just a comment about a conversation that came up during the operator forum last week. And that is, you know, the tour operators are putting together components they're not actually responsible for or controlling the product, whether it's the supplier, the hotel room, the bus, the attraction. How can they instill, well, first of all, how can they demand, I guess, that there are standards of whatever they become, health and hygiene, at those suppliers? And then how can they instill confidence in their clients, their international buyers that they're working with, that they have some control over that?
So the good news is that I've often said and thought that the tour operator has a lot of leverage because there's typically more than one of whatever it is you're partnering with. There's more than one hotel. There's more than one motor coach company. There may only be one, you know, Statue of Liberty, but in most instances, you're able to demand the assurances that you want to get about health and safety. And what I've recommended to companies over the years is that they have some kind of, I call like a hierarchy of risk. So the activities where the most risk is, they do follow-up surveys over safety and safe practices. So they can work with the hotels or the motor coach companies. And we've always thought about it in a different sense, but in now the personal hygiene sense, we can be asking the suppliers, what are you doing to keep up with the best practices? And we can then use that to sell it to our out-of-country partners by saying, here's what we're doing with our in-country partners. Here's what we're doing with our hotel. We're having them fill out this questionnaire. And maybe initially we do it every 6 months until we're less worried about the crisis. But I think that we can I think domestically, everyone's going to want to work together to lure and make attractive the inbound market. And we can do that by saying to our out-of-country partners, here's how the companies here in the US are reacting to this. I read a survey this morning about where people are getting their information about being safe to travel. And a lot of people are looking to government agencies around the world, CDC and others. And I think the more we can do to promote our country through our company and through our country and through these government entities is the best bet for doing that. So I'm just reading here. PayPal charges a $20 fee for each chargeback, even though the charge has been fraudulent. Yeah, I hate PayPal, okay? Let there be no doubt, I have not had any luck with them on transactions. They don't even seem to care what we write. I would switch your credit card provider, like processor, and not work with them. Even worse is the companies that are charging you for arbitration or pre-arbitration. Like, we've done nothing wrong, but they penalize us like we've got to pay to try to get a fair resolution. So I do think, and I do think that is definitely a problem. And it's attractive because some of these new processors, I'll call them, have cheaper percentages and they're more appealing to you to want to work with them. But by and large, most success I've had lately, by the way, has been with American Express, because they seem to be the company that's actually willing to read, listen, and understand. And if I were to make like a percentage assessment, my American Express wins are about 75%, and my Visa wins are about 35%.
Wow, that's impressive.
Well, I feel like it's not great, but well, I'm really happy that we were able to be here. I don't know if we happy to stay as long as y'all want or to answer questions. Greg and Alastair know equal or more than I do about any of this, so they can all chime in.
I mean, the only thing that I would add to that is just to say this is where you really see the true value of an association like IITA, is that, you know, what you want to do is try to ensure that there's redundancy, you know, in the vetting that you do. Everybody's going to be asking the same questions about safety and health. So talk to your fellow association members and ask what vendors they're using, ask what vendors are specifically addressing these issues well. Share that information, and that'll be helpful, and it'll allow you to not have to go down the same path every single time. You can, you know, talk to your fellow association members and pick up on, you know, good tips of, you know, vendors that they're using with success who are answering the questions, the tough questions about health and safety.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Oh, go ahead.
No,
Alastair,
I was just going to say, certainly if anyone has any questions, Lisa, Rebecca, you have my contact information. So if there's any follow-up post this call, obviously delighted to address any insurance-related questions.
Wonderful. Well, I have a feeling we might be inviting all of you back again soon. So if anybody does have any questions, please let us know, and we will get them both to Jeff and Alastair and Greg. We'll try to see if we can't do this once again.
Right.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.